Welcome to the Debauchery program, brought to you by Cliff Cool's Notes, a daily consolidator of the most insightful presentations, articles, essays, and the interviews on the web on the ultimate confidence game, money. Our site presents ideas from the smartest and wisest money managers, economists, and analysts.
Hi, my name is Monique Rollins. Today we're talking to Doug French of Casey Research. At the conference, you talk a lot about Austrian economics. In what ways is Austrian economics better explain what caused the financial crisis?
The recent financial crisis in 2008 really personified what Austrian economics is all about in terms of the Austrian trade cycle or the Austrian business cycle theory, which is that if you have an intervention by the central bank lowering interest rates below their natural rate, or what interest rates would normally be if they were set by the market, tends to direct investment dollars or capital dollars into longer term investments, let's say housing or factories or casinos or capital goods like that instead of consumer goods. And that's what we saw after 2001, after 9/11, when the Federal Reserve panicked. They thought the economy was going to go into free fall after 9/11, so they lowered interest rates precipitously. Money rushed into housing right away. The low interest rates inspired a lot of people to speculate in housing where they normally wouldn't have. And then you saw this huge increase in prices of housing and real estate in general. Then the Federal Reserve reacted to that. They started to hike interest rates. They cut off that boom, and of course, they hiked interest rates right up until 2006, which, not coincidentally, was the height of at least in the United States, of housing prices, and then this precipitated a crash. And this is what the Austrians would say is the Austrian business cycle theory. And so Austrians have been able to predict these booms and busts throughout history, and they predicted the latest one. Neoclassical economists, Keynesian economics, Keynesians would say, well, booms are just irrational investors or animal spirits, as Lord Keynes used to call them, but people have animal spirits all the time. That doesn't tell us why in this particular time frame that people piled into housing. Neoclassical economists would say, gee, rational expectations would say everybody acts rationally. There's no such thing as a boom and bust. In fact, one of the current Nobel Prize winners, Eugene Fama, contends up and down that there is no such thing as a boom and bust, and that everyone is acting rationally. Well, I can tell you from being in Las Vegas during the boom, people don't necessarily act rationally in a boom, and these low interest rates provide the fuel to inspire these huge booms that take on a life of their own, and then of course these investments become uneconomic, and ultimately you have a crash.
What is the Austrian economic solution for Western and debt-ridden governments to get out of their debt crises?
Well, I think that Austrians would fall into the austerity category, where Western economies have lived way beyond their means for way too long. They've built up decade upon decade upon decade of debt. So government needs to slim down, if not go away. And in some cases, debt probably should just be repudiated. And all governments are probably bankrupt, really, by any rational standard. But yet the United States, even though they have had their credit rating take it down some, they're still considered, United States bonds considered one of the safest assets in the world. But there is no possible way that United States debt will ever be repaid. And it's probably the same way in Canada or any Western government. So people need to come to that realization. Governments need to come to that realization, make the hard choices to cut back, and just probably in a way walk away from the debt. Now, politically, that's not going to happen. And what will they do? Well, they'll try to inflate it away. And governments always want control of the printing press, because if they can make more dollars, make more currency, then the debt that they have to pay is worth less in that inflated money. And so they intend not to walk away from the debt, but try to inflate it away.
That's interesting. So in your opinion, what would you say is with no government intervention, where would you put the people, like the top 1%, how would you differentiate between them and the poor if there was no government intervention?
Well, if there was no, if there was no government, and the reason we have a 1% and a 99% is because of government. And I have somewhat of a soft spot or some sympathy for the 99%. But I think the 99%'s hatred is misdirected. I don't think they should have focused it at Wall Street. I think they should have focused it at Washington, D.C., and they should focus it at the Federal Reserve, because that's where Wall Street gets its power. The two are intertwined. Wall Street doesn't have anything to do with Main Street. It has everything to do with K Street in Washington, D.C. And so, yes, the 99% are disenfranchised. During this latest boom, we can see that more and more people are on food stamps. We have high unemployment rate. We have more and more people that are just flat giving up and leaving the workforce. And yet, Wall Street gets richer. Stock prices are at all-time highs. Junk bonds are trading at all-time highs. So the gentleman that I took my economics training from was Murray Rothbard, and Murray Rothbard used to say that it was the people who got the money first who benefited. The way money is created through the banking system, with the help of the Federal Reserve. Well, we can see that the people getting the money first right now is Washington and Wall Street. And Washington real estate and New York real estate is doing fine. The economies in those cities, the economies on Wall Street, they're doing great, yet the rest of the country, at least the United States, is being left behind. And so that is what I would tell the 99% is, be angry, you have every right to be, you're saddled with $1 trillion worth of student debt that you're never going to be able to dig out of, you're probably not going to have the jobs to pay that off, and you should be mad about it, but don't direct it at Wall Street. Wall Street is just playing the game that's been set up for them by Washington and continues to be put in place by Washington.
Who are your most favorite Austrian economists and why?
Well, I would have to say Murray Rothbard, because I studied under Murray Rothbard at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. I had no idea what Austrian economics was. I had no idea what libertarianism was. I had just moved to Las Vegas and decided to pursue a master's in economics. And I had taken about 2 classes. I was looking in the course catalog, and I saw EC 742, History of Economic Thought. The instructor was Rothbard. And I actually asked one of my classmates, I said, do you know anything about this Rothbard guy? And he said, no, you shouldn't take him. He's a kook. You should take it with independent study with someone else. I didn't want to mess around with that. So I went ahead and took Murray Rothbard. Of course, he was the dean of the Austrian School. He was considered Mr. Libertarian. And well, my life was changed forever. I remember the first night he came into class, and the minute he hit the classroom, he just started talking. There was no syllabus, there was no taking roll. He had centuries of ground to cover, and he was a wonderful, wonderful man, both as a person and as a friend, and as an inspiration. He was the chairman of my thesis committee, and he was a walking bibliography. Every class period was full of reading suggestions. When I told him what I wanted to write my thesis about, he gave me 10, 12 sources right off the top of his head. And a lot of people can't believe that I didn't know who Rothbard was when I took his class, but to illustrate that I didn't, what Murray did was assign a 10-page paper in every class, and we could write it on anything, but we had to approve the topic with him. So I went in and I said, Dr. Rothbard, I want to write on the Great Depression. And he said, oh, that's great. And he gave me a variety of sources, look at this, look at that. And at the end he says, oh, by the way, I wrote a book about the Depression.
Oh, wow.
It's called America's Great Depression. Not only was it a book about the Depression, it is the book about the Depression. And I was so naive thinking back on it that I would, as a student, write on something that he is essentially the expert on. Yeah. So, but it was a wonderful experience to study under Murray, and he continues to be an inspiration for me.
What role has the Federal Reserve and other central banks played in causing credit and asset bubbles?
Well, they do it actually in a couple of different ways. They create money that is very cheap with the idea that they're going to create employment. All the economists at the Fed are Keynesians, and they believe that we have this lack of aggregate demand. And so to increase the aggregate demand, they feel like cheap money will go to entrepreneurs who will use the cheap money or borrow the cheap money to create new enterprises and create employment. But what happens is that money does not reach employers on the street that might hire, say, you or I. It ends up on Wall Street. It ends up in commodity markets. It ends up in speculation. So what happens is this cheap money always ends up in stock prices, which it is now, or possibly commodity prices, art prices, modern art, expensive art is higher than it's ever been. All this cheap money has to go somewhere. It's not coming down the Main Street. It's clogged up at Wall Street. And while the Fed ostensibly says that their policies are to increase employment, really what their policies do is to provide cheap fuel for hedge fund managers and for other investment pros on Wall Street to funnel money into asset prices. And that's where it's gone. Eventually these prices hit a peak, they crash. In some cases, it'll come down to Main Street, end up in housing, as it did in 2004, 2005, 2006. But currently, the booms that we have going, at least in the United States, are farmland and the art market, junk bond prices, and stock prices. We will have, I'm sure, rolling crashes in those asset prices. And as they pour more money into them, other bubbles will be created. Who knows what they will be, where they will be, but that's what they create with their policies. I think that the United States, right now, we are in a place where I think Europe has been for a long, long time, where you have this extraordinary increase in government regulation, this extraordinary presence of the Federal Reserve that is now not just a central bank, but essentially a central planner. And this central planning has essentially stunted, or is trying to stunt, the entrepreneurial horsepower that has typically been what has generated a wonderful prosperity in the United States. That sort of keeping us from hitting bottom is what's going to keep us from growing again. So I see this stagnation in the United States that has been similar in Europe for a long time. In other words, we're at 7% unemployment, depending on the measurement. It could be higher. Long-term unemployment is at a high. A lot of people are leaving the workforce, period. That's been going on in Europe for a long time. Young people having a hard time getting a job. In some places in Europe, young people never get a job. It's like a lost generation. Same way in Japan. I see the United States going the same way. A guy that Austrians don't quote very often, but I think maybe has this right, is Paul Krugman, who sees the United States as somewhat of a going through a period similar to Japan, where you have this great stagnation with the occasional banking crisis thrown in. It's like the worst of all worlds. And I think that's what we're looking forward to in the United States. The good news, though, in the United States is we have entrepreneurs, especially in the tech realm, who make our lives better each and every day with, we all carry around something in our hand that gives us the answer to virtually every question we could ever have. We can communicate with all our friends constantly. And it's just been a wonderful boon to all of our living standards. Think how much greater it would even be beyond that if government would get out of the way. But they are not going to get out of the way. They're going to probably try to tamp down that technology. They're going to try to tax that technology. Pretty soon in the United States, there'll be, right now we can order from Amazon and not pay taxes, and next day delivery. I can't remember a time when we didn't have Amazon. I can't remember a time when we didn't have Wikipedia where I could get the answer to anything at my fingertips. I fear the government's going to try to get in the way of this. However, I believe that technology will stay one step ahead. I heard it put recently that there's 3 horses in the race, and one of them is the free trade horse, and one is the technology horse, and then you have the stupid horse, which is government. And as long as the free trade horse and the technology horse stay ahead of the stupid horse, we're all better off. And I think that's where we are for now, and I'm rooting against the stupid horse, shall we say.
What bubbles are now prevalent globally?
I think there's bubbles, again, in farmland. Is a very prominent bubble in the United States. I think that junk bonds continue to be a bubble in the United States. Stocks, in many ways. When you look at the stocks that are making all-time highs, it's things like Netflix. It's things like Google. And these are great things. I'm a subscriber to Netflix, and I couldn't live a minute without Google. But again, I'm not sure this is a sort of an engine of any sort of job creation that's out there. So it really makes you wonder about the valuations of those particular stocks. But by far the biggest probably bubble in the history of the world is United States Treasury debt.
Yes.
There is no way that being compensated at 2.5% a year for a 10-year bond, or 3.5% for 30 years for the debt of an entity that is hopelessly bankrupt. There is no way that is a correct valuation, and so that bubble will ultimately pop. I don't know when it will be, but I think it is honestly the biggest bubble that history's ever seen.
Yes. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.